How many people have really died in Gaza, and how many were civilians? With Hamas data frequently reported without question on the news, statistical analyst and computer scientist Mark Zlochin reveals the truth about the inaccuracies, impossibilities, and outright lies in the war of data. I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti.
Mark Zlochin, thank you very much for joining me. I've been reading your tweets with some interest about the statistics to do with the casualty numbers in Gaza, and that's what we're going to discuss today in some detail. So I'm really pleased that you're able to take the time. And just for people watching, to set the scene and to explain your background first, could you explain on what basis you've been analysing the data and why your insight matters?
Well, maybe just a word or two about my background. I'm originally coming from the computer science. I have a PhD from Technon's leading technological institute here in Israel. My thesis was dealing with computational mathematical methods and statistical learning. So I have a strong background in statistics and a strong interest in the statistical research. And quite naturally, when the war started and the numbers started to flow in, I was curious to see, does it make sense? And the more the war progressed, the less sense the numbers made. So this is basically the place from which I started to analyzing it in more depth, trying to understand what's going on there.
So that background in statistical analysis is an important one, because I think even if we can't see exactly how many people there are injured and killed in Gaza ourselves, we can look at the data as it's presented and search within it for clues that make it accurate or inaccurate. Is that, in short, what you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, one of the questions I get. I think it's important to say it up front, before we go into the details. People tell me, okay, you show that many of the statistics that Hamas are reporting are garbage. Do you know what is the exact number? So my honest answer is I don't. Okay, but the fact that we don't know is not an excuse to use something that is clearly garbage. I mean, I think this is an important. I think this is one of the cardinal sins of the media. They don't like the answer "we don't know." I mean, they prefer a bad answer to the answer "we don't know."
I actually always say in this sort of asymmetrical information war that the public and the media prefer a beautiful lie to an ugly truth. And I think in this case, actually, what they prefer is a tidy lie to a very untidy truth. So on that basis, let's kick off and talk a little bit about some of the common misconceptions before we dive straight into the data itself. Firstly, I want to look at the idea that we've seen a lot in the media, that the numbers given by Hamas in previous conflicts have been historically accurate in the long run.
Yeah, this is something, this is the first answer I get whenever I ask questions about the specifics. They say, never mind, I don't want to hear. We know that in the previous rounds it was accurate. So there are two important caveats here. The first one, and this is really what is unique about this war in comparison to all the previous rounds. Up to this war, there was what is called the protection cluster. This is a UN cluster of organizations who were basically independently verifying the numbers that Gazan authorities were publishing. Okay, they had people on the ground. They checked the medical records. They checked the circumstances of the death. In some cases, they were able to distinguish between combatants and civilians, not always accurately, but at least they tried. This is absolutely non-existent in this war. There is zero independent verification. There are zero people on the ground who are actually doing the legwork and trying to check the information that Hamas puts out. So this is one major distinction, okay? We cannot just say, okay, it was okay in the past, it must be okay now, because now the situation on the ground is very different. This is one thing that's important to emphasize. The other thing is, in previous wars, we had the numbers that the Hamas authorities were publishing. You had the independent verification. And then after the war, Israel was conducting its own investigation, after the area is clear and you can actually, go ask people about the circumstances, etc., etc. And it is correct that if we talk about the total numbers, there was a general agreement. I mean, give or take 10%, 15% to that direction or the other direction. If we talk about the totals, it was pretty much consistent. However, there was always a big difference in estimate of the civilians versus the combatants. I mean, the usual practice of Hamas authorities, the Gazan authorities, is everyone is civilian. I mean, they have explicit PR policy. They have, there are documents that they've actually distributed to the activists with instructions. Every casualty reported as a civilian casualty. Never mentioned that someone was a combatant.
And those, again, it's not a propaganda claim. Those have been revealed in the past through groups like Memory who translate Arabic material.
For people who investigate this in the past, it's a known fact.
Yeah.
You have print screens, you have screenshots of the instructions that were sent out, etc., etc. Yeah. So the basic policy of the Gazan authorities was always claim that everyone is a civilian. And obviously, they were not reporting the combatants numbers at all. The UN organization have tried to make the distinction, not always successfully. When IDF conducted its own investigations after the fact, and it's always after the fact because there is no time to do it in real time when the war is going on. They usually found out that somewhere around 40 to 50% of the of the casualties were combatants. And it's not just IDF saying this. There was at least one precedent, I think it was in 2008, when 2 years after the fact, Hamas admitted that those numbers were correct. I mean, that the IDF estimate of the number of combatants was indeed correct. So to recap, even if there is reasonable accuracy of the total numbers in the past, still it doesn't tell us anything about the combatants to civilian ratio. And I think this is a critical one because, I mean, we hear a lot of claims about, genocide and indiscriminate bombing, etc., intentionally targeting civilians. If we know what the ratio is, it tells us a lot about how the war is conducted. I mean, if you have, in many wars, you have a ratio as high as 9 civilians per one combatant. I mean, if we take like Syria and places like this, even in the places when, say, US or UK were involved, ratio between 2 to 3 civilians per combatant was considered a good one. Okay? As we will see in this war, the ratio is probably more closer to something like 2 combatants per 3 civilians, or even 1 per 1, which is about twice better than what US or UK were doing in Iraq and Syria.
Well, it's quite a grim statistic generally, because obviously it's talking about dead people.
And this is something. I mean, one of the reasons you were talking about the beautiful lie before that. I mean, every reasonable person would like to see 0 civilian casualties. Right. Yeah, I mean, especially when you see pictures of kids, and this is excruciating. I mean, nobody wants to see it. And people who are not familiar with the horrors of war think that if we see civilian casualties, that it must be something is wrong. Yeah. Israel is doing something wrong. And I don't know, I wanted to say unfortunately, but it's fortunate for most people who are not familiar with this grim reality, that the unfortunate reality of war, there are always civilian casualties. And the critical question is the army, whatever army, I'm not talking only about IDF, I mean, every army, is the army, even other soldiers on the ground, doing enough to minimize the civilian casualties as much as possible?
Yeah.
Okay. It's unrealistic to expect 0, but we want to make it as low a number as possible. And I think this is one of the key points of what we're about to talk when we dive into the numbers, that the ratios, I mean, if we look at the actual numbers, the breakdown of the numbers, they indicate that the Israeli claim that doing everything possible to minimize the casualties are correct. I mean, the data supports it. If we really, if we don't satisfy ourselves with the headlines that are usually coming, they're not even coming from the Gaza Health Ministry. They're coming from what is called Government Media Office, which is basically a propaganda department.
So you've touched there on the idea that there are lots of different sources. We hear about the Gaza Health Ministry a lot in the news, but there's also the GMO, and there are other lists. There is even a point at which they stopped counting in the same way in Gaza, and they started to use sort of self-reporting where civilians could report using an online Google form for practical reasons. One can't be too critical. They are in a difficult situation there. But maybe you could talk us through the data that you're basing your analysis on in the first place before we dive into the actual numbers.
So this is a critical point when I was talking about the difference. I mean, how the situation now and how the numbers now are different from the way they were produced before. In all the previous wars, all the numbers were coming from Ministry of Health. And they have a modern tracking system, computer system that aggregates all the data. They have trained statisticians who are putting this in the database and processing and everything. And because of the intensity of this war, which is unprecedented, it must be noted that this war is much more intensive and much larger in scope than all the previous rounds were. At some point, at least this is what they say, the centralized data collection system broke down. And so they were doing whatever they can, to gather information without using the established protocol, established procedure, established infrastructure. And just to put it in perspective, currently, only about half of the numbers are actually coming from the hospitals. I mean, there is a body that was brought to the hospital, identified, and put into the database. Only half of the numbers issued currently, the official death counts were counted this way. Slightly above 50%, something like 55% maybe. The self-reports that you mentioned, it was a recent information they have just published. They said how much it's widespread just about a week ago. It turns out that about 10% of all the death reports are coming from self-reports of the regular Gazans, which means that if a person is missing, and this includes, for example, the prisoners that IDF are taking, as far as their family is concerned, they might be missing. They still can report them as if they are dead, without presenting the body, without presenting any proof of death. All they need is just to enter there is this Google form that they can fill in the name. So about 10% of the reported numbers, so we're talking about 32,000, close to 3,000 reported deaths are coming from this database. I mean, people who just reported that their relative is dead. And it turned out, this is something I found out about a week ago, the Ministry of Health is doing zero verification about those reports.
How did you find that out?
Because, first of all, by their own definition, they defined a verified complete information as entry that you have a name of the person, ID number, date of birth, and the age at which they were killed. Many entries don't have this information. Many entries just have the name. That's all. No ID number, no information about date of birth, age, date of death, nothing. Just
and as you say, even somebody that's missing has all of those pieces of data, which you can easily put into a form, even in good faith, believing that person is dead. I could list somebody's name, age, date of birth, an ID number, without them necessarily being dead, and I may do that in all good intention, but be listing somebody that isn't yet dead. So that if that's all the data they have no body, they've got no way of checking.
Yeah, and the least I would expect, I mean, if the Ministry of Health were acting in good faith, the least I would expect is, okay, at least verify that the report has an ID number, and it's a valid ID number, and it's an actual existing person, and just verify that the information is correct.
And we might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but I read in one of your pieces of analysis about the ID numbers. There was a certain chunk of the data where you actually check the ID numbers. You can't check them one by one personally, but you can see if they're valid ID numbers or not because of the shape of the number and the number of numbers, and there's a check number at the end. So tell us a bit about that as we're there.
Yeah, it turns out that about out of almost 3,000 reports, these self-reports, 500 were duplicate of the reported deaths that were already in the database. So there are 500 people who appeared twice, counted twice in the total count. Okay, and there are over 2,000 people overall in all the database, not only the self-reports, also the allegedly data coming from the hospitals. Over 2,000 people don't have a valid ID number.
And explain what you mean by a non-valid ID number.
The ID number has 9 digits. So there are many entries that don't have ID number at all, or have just random 2 or 3 digits, or sometimes 7 digits, sometimes 8 digits. So there are those who don't even have the correct number of digits. And out of those that do have 9 digits, you can verify if this is a valid number. There is pretty simple algorithm to check this. And there are about 1,500 numbers to just not valid. And you can actually see, if you look at the file, you see that the numbers run in sequences. Like someone just typed in subsequent numbers in the hospitals. Most of those are coming from the hospitals, not from the self-reports.
So again, to just spell it out, in some of those sections of the data in the tables, the ID numbers of the dead are going up by 1 digit each time. Yeah. And that would mean that people who had been issued their IDs in order were dying also in order.
Not only that,
and being found in order.
Numbers are just not valid numbers because the last digit is not arbitrary. I mean, you cannot put any digit in the last place. There is, for every combination of 8 first digits, there is only one right digit that could be in
so the last digit, the 9th digit, is a sort of checksum to show that the first 8 digits are valid.
Yeah, exactly. And it was basically made for avoiding clerical errors.
And so in fact, whoever input those numbers didn't know that or didn't bother to
apparently
fake it correctly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the ID numbers. I interrupted you there, but so we've got the hospital records and then there's the self-reporting you've mentioned. What about the GMO?
Okay, this is the funniest part. I mean, funny and not funny, but up to 1 week ago, all they were saying is there are some confirmed, verified numbers coming from the hospitals, and there are what they called reliable media reports. And there were a couple of journalists who approached them and tried to understand what does it mean, what media those numbers are coming from, how are they verified, how they process, and nobody succeeded to get any answer. It was known that part of those numbers are self-reports, but until 1 week ago, we didn't know how much. So now, basically, after the last couple of reports, we do know that out of allegedly 33,000 people dead, about 18,000 came allegedly from the hospital, and I will explain why I say allegedly. About 3,000 come from those self-reports, and the remaining, something like 11,000, it's really not clear where they come from. I mean, because in the last months or so, there were several people who, like me, conducted some investigation of this, and they looked at the numbers and they just said the numbers don't make sense. Something is really off with those so-called reliable media sources. Okay, we'll get to it in a minute, what exactly is off there. And it looks like at some point people at the health ministry realized that it's too conspicuous. It really doesn't make sense. So they changed the terminology. They don't talk about the reliable media sources anymore. They talk about the Ministry of Health records. They talk about the self-reports. And now they talk about people with incomplete information, incomplete data.
So in a way, they're acknowledging that incomplete data, they're not saying it, but they're acknowledging that there's a problem in the lists and the statistics by saying, well, it's incomplete data. They're not giving a reason why it's incomplete, how it's incomplete, or if that invalidates that bit of the data, right?
Yeah. How is it incomplete and what are the sources? I mean, where do they get those numbers from? Where do they get those reports? They never say, okay? Until 1 week ago, they said we get it from the media sources.
And media sources, I mean, I'm not sure what that means in people's understanding. It could mean television, newspapers, as you say.
This is what everyone was asking.
Media doesn't really mean anything.
There are a couple of journalists who contacted the officials in the health ministry and tried to get an answer exactly to this question. What do they mean by media sources? Okay, is this reports, in the newspapers, in the television, in social media? What kind of media are you talking about? And nobody managed to get a clear answer from
and
this.
Reliable media sources turn out, if they're now acknowledging that there is a certain amount of incomplete data, turn out not to be that reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically they say that all the information that came from reliable media sources were either self-reports or something with incomplete information.
And we've dealt with how self-reporting can be statistically problematic. And now we're looking at the rest of it, which is incomplete data and therefore also problematic. So in a way, from a statistical data analysis point of view, we almost have to chuck out all of those.
Yeah, I think basically, and this is something I was trying to do, was to contact Israeli authorities who I suppose must have some sort of copy of population registry. Turns out nobody on the Israeli side, at least the officials, bothered themselves with checking those information. But I did get, last night, somebody from Kogat, the government body that is in charge of all the coordination with the Palestinian side, someone from there contacted me, and we have a conversation scheduled in 2 hours. So maybe I'll get some answer from them.
Well,
but
give us an update if you do.
Yeah, I'll be glad to share. But basically, we know that the formally called reliable sources are not really reliable. We talk about the problems with self-reports. And the craziest thing is that if we look at the official numbers from originating from the Ministry of Health itself, which by their own definition is supposed to be complete information, turns out that it's nothing but complete. I mean, even if though in this part of the reports, which are supposed to have all the information, and all information again means name, ID number, date of birth, age, and date of death. First of all the documents they published a list of all allegedly killed people that they have in the Ministry of Health records. Not a single one shows the date of death. So it's impossible to know if they have it in the records and just chose not to share it, or not even that.
So I get that. That's also obviously quite important, because the other thing that I've seen a lot in the reporting is that as Israel has continued this war, its strategy has developed and changed. And often you might expect in that situation that the number of civilian deaths, at least, would go down as they become more accurate at targeting, thanks to intelligence that they glean from the battlefield so far. So we can't really judge that either, because the statistics are just released ad hoc by the Gazan authorities without any actual date of death. And I think that's important to note as well. And let's move on a bit to look at the nuts and bolts of the figures themselves, because they do give some other data. That we've seen another statistic bandied about quite a lot, which is this 70% of the deaths have been women and children. And I'd like also, just before we deal with that, to also introduce again this idea of the ratio of civilians to non-civilians. So non-civilians being people involved in the fighting or in terrorism. And obviously that's a whole other conversation, how one defines those people, because under international law, there are specific requirements for those. Israel's judgment, I know actually from talks with legal advisors within the Israeli authorities, are actually relatively conservative. They could be much tougher in how they define a combatant, but that's another discussion for another day. I'd like, therefore, to focus now on this 70% women and children, combined with the idea of all of these 33,000 are civilians. We hear both of these things quite a lot, whether deliberately or accidentally.
Well, first of all, it's very interesting to understand where this number 70% came from. It's basically very close to the percentage of children and women in general population. So the 70% women and children among the casualties implies that there is indiscriminate killing. I mean, that the demographic characteristics of the people who are killed are exactly the demographic characteristics of the general population. I mean,
which, just to translate it into journalist terms, would mean Israel's indiscriminate in its killings, and therefore it's targeting all Gazans, and it would mean that its army is either entirely malicious or entirely useless, because it's not successful in any respect at targeting fighters. So it would have to, it's again, as a journalist, I think that's quite a leap to make. It's quite difficult when Israel is known historically to have a quite professional and often quite accurate army in terms of its military action.
Yeah, and I think that this is a narrative that started from day one. I mean, this is quite amazing. I mean, you have a war, and the war changes. The dynamic of the war changes. First, it was only the air strikes, and after 3 weeks, the ground operation started. So you would expect the statistics to change. I mean, at least you would expect to see at least some fluctuation. But this 70% number was amazingly consistent throughout the war. This is the number that GMO was reporting. I think recently they started to play with it a bit to add a couple of percentage points this way or that way. But for most of the war, they just repeating the same number, which is all by itself is suspicious. I mean, you do expect to see some variation. You do expect to see some changes.
I think that's a good observation, because airstrikes, you might understand, could be more indiscriminate or less discriminate, whereas hand-to-hand fighting in tunnels or in areas that have been mostly cleared of civilians who were taken from the north down to the south, you would expect the fierce fighting there to have a much higher ratio of men over a certain age, not necessarily 18. And that's another complicating factor. Some minors, officially children, are signed up fully fledged Hamas fighters as well. So you'll often find 16, 17-year-olds among the fighting forces of Hamas, right?
Yeah, exactly. So now, if we look at the numbers, I mean, in the beginning, it was difficult to verify because we just got numbers, just general reports. But in the end of October, they released for the first time, they released a document with the list of people. And already at that point, it was clear that it's not 70%, it's less. Not by much, but it was less than 70%. Okay, there was something like several thousand more fighting age males than you would expect in comparison to completely random bombing. So even if you compare it to the existing numbers of Ministry of Health itself, you've seen that it was never 70%. But I think this is an important thing to emphasize. You have those two bodies who are they're different in principle. They're different in their nature and of what they do, and naturally they're different in the standards of accuracy. With all the criticism I have towards the Ministry of Health, it's still a relatively professional body with some level of commitment to accuracy. GMO, the Government Media Office, is by definition a propaganda outlet. Okay, they have zero standards. They have zero professional oversight. Someone to look, give an opinion. Okay, this is too much. It doesn't make sense. Don't put it out. So you have those two sources which are working virtually independently. I mean, GMO, when you look at the numbers that GMO producing, you see that they're utterly arbitrary. I mean, you see round numbers. Every time they add 100 women here and 50 children there,
And as a data analyst or statistician, is that a general rule of thumb that round numbers just don't happen? Certainly not all the time.
I mean, it's a very crude criteria, but if you see consistently, that the numbers are, I mean, this alone is not enough to say there is a fabrication. There are many reasons why this might occur once in a while. But if you see that this is happening consistently, and for example, I mean, throughout the war, they report the same number, 7,000 people missing. It was this number in the beginning of the war. This is the same number they repeat now, which means that somebody who is not very proficient in math, on statistics, just decided on an arbitrary number and was just blindly repeated without stopping for a second to ask.
And so even to be charitable, one would have to say that's got to be an estimate, if not a lie.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing is, because we have those two sources in information, I mean, the first one is GMO is consistent. They issue regular updates. Ministry of Health, because of actual problems, actual challenges they had, were issuing reports much more sporadically. I mean, once a month, 2 times a month, they were issuing a more detailed report with more detailed information, not only about the casualties, but about the medical situation in general. How many people are sick, how many people are transferred to Egypt for treatment, etc., etc. But they were also publishing the casualties numbers, and they had a detailed breakdown by the hospital, because every hospital was reporting the numbers independently. So it was possible to look at those detailed numbers, which are relatively more accurate and relatively more reliable, and compare it to what the GMO was publishing. And the most outrageous, glaring inconsistency that I found was that if you just subtract those numbers, you take the totals that GMO is claiming, and you take the numbers from the hospital records that the Ministry of Health is issuing, and you look what's happening in the gap, what happened, the difference, the media sources, so-called reliable media sources. It turned out that only 7% of those reported deaths are men.
7%.
And 7%, yes. And something like, I think it's something like over 60% of them are children.
Right.
Okay. So it tells you something about the reliability of those reliable media sources. I mean, it demonstrates how the GMO reports just don't make any. I mean, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt and you say, okay, they have incomplete information and they're trying to do the best they can with what they have, it still doesn't make any sense to have 60% children and 7% men. I mean, order of magnitude difference. It's just. And with the recent report, the last report, when they published, the detailed names and everything, they changed the reporting system, and they started reporting how much of the death counts are coming from the self-reports. It became even more ridiculous.
How so?
I mean, because now they say, okay, we have verified death coming from those two sources, and we have incomplete information coming from whatever it's coming from. If we look at the number of children not accounted for, it's more than the total number they claim is unaccounted for. Okay, you have something like 1,000 more women and children who are supposedly with incomplete information than the number they claim there is.
So basically, within themselves, the statistics aren't consistent and therefore unreliable.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they have a negative number of men with incomplete information. You have like over 1,000 men with incomplete.
Do they ever correct these inconsistencies? Because accidents can happen.
Again, because the numbers the GMO reporting are consistent. I mean, they're reported every day. So if there is a big change, you can see it. And there wasn't big change in any of those. And because the numbers that are coming from the Ministry of Health also have a breakdown by the hospitals, you can also see that there's... and this is something I'm currently investigating to understand how this happened. I mean, how those... negative number of men appeared in the
But what I'm asking, I suppose, is a good example from the other side is near the beginning of the war, Israel said that 1,400 people had been killed in the October the 7th attacks within Israel, and then they changed it to 1,200 fairly quickly, saying that the other 200 were probably actually terrorists who had been killed as well, and the bodies, once identified through a painstaking process in Israel, had been identified as non-Israeli or non-Israeli civilians, and that's a correction that the more reliable statistical reporter would make. Does that sort of thing happen in any of the statistics you've seen from Gaza?
No, haven't seen even once.
Okay.
I mean, the numbers are always revised upwards, never downwards.
And similarly, I remember when there were the international media reports, which totally took at face value the Palestinian claim that the Al-Ahli hospital had been bombed by Israel and 500 people had been killed. That number 500 was released very quickly. Many said too quickly for it to be accurate. Also, again, very round number. When it was then revealed that Israel's claim that the hospital had not been actually bombed, but the car park had been bombed by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had fallen short. When that was shown to be true with evidence, the US confirmed it. The number of dead, I believe, went down to dozens rather than hundreds. But did the official statistics...
Maybe I think the 50 dead was the maximum estimate of how many people died.
And so did 450 ever come off that running total from the Gaza Health Authority?
This is the crazy thing, because in this report that they issued in October, they provided the full list and they also showed graphs how it changed over time. And the report was issued on October 27, 10 days after the Al-Ahli incident. And you can still see 10 days afterwards, you still see this 500 people spike on the 17th of October.
And I remember actually from another context, during the COVID era, which we all remember sadly too well, there were all sorts of other death counts going on around the world. And here in the UK, you would see alterations, adjustments. You'd even see variations on weekends when the bodies that count were not at full speed working at the same regularity. So there was always a spike on Mondays when they caught up. We don't see any of that sort of characteristic authenticity in the running totals, do we, from Gaza?
I think if again, it shows the disconnect between what Ministry of Health is doing and what this GMO is doing, because in Ministry of Health reports you do see some attempts to self-correct. Again, not enough, not efficiently enough, but okay, I mean, in the last report that I'm studying, I don't have the full conclusions yet, but they do seem to have some revisions of the numbers in the hospitals. Still not clear what exactly they've done there. Me and several other people are studying this now, but they do try to self-correct, at least sometimes. With GMO, is just, constantly very uniformly raising numbers, never go down, always go up. Sometimes you have updates in the breakdown, and you suddenly see that there is a negative number of men who were supposedly killed on those days. So again, it demonstrates the relative reliability of the two sources. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, what GMO puts out is complete garbage. I mean, there is no reason to trust anything of what they say.
And the health authority? And the health authority?
The health authorities, I have a lot of criticism about what they issue. I mean, there are a lot of obvious sanity checks that they're not doing. There are many signs of manipulations, at least on the specific hospitals level. In some hospitals, you see that someone is playing with the numbers, that they just don't add up. And in other hospitals, you see more reliable work. So I think you don't have a uniform answer. I think it depends on the specific people who are doing the work and who aggregates this together and issues the final reports.
So to be clear, when you see media outlets like the incredibly powerful and influential BBC with its fact checkers from BBC Verify quote numbers from the GMO, what do you make of that?
First of all, I make that they're not fact-checked anything. I mean, there are some things that you don't have to be a statistician, you don't have to understand, the record keeping or data management. You just need to look at the obvious. I mean, like the example I brought earlier. I mean, if you have 7% men coming for a certain source and versus over 60% children, if you do some basic fact checking, you will at least ask questions. I mean, even if you don't say this is fake, if you don't say it's fabrication, but at least you're getting curious. You're asking what's going on. You go to the authorities and ask, okay, how did you get this number? Where is it coming from? The fact that none of this question was asked said that there was zero fact checking as far as I'm concerned.
So it's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's not necessarily surprising to those of us who've been following it from the start and who have kept a critical mind. But I think there's been a reluctance to even bother questioning statistics. And I think that part of the reason is that maybe most readers and sadly most journalists feel a little bit lost when looking at numbers. So they want to take them at face value. It's why it's important that someone like you is doing this work.
My expectation from a journalist, maybe call me naive, would be, to be curious about the details, to be curious about the nuances. I mean, not just the headline, not just the global statistics, but to see what the statistics is composed from. And for example, the fact that the dynamics of war are changing, so the statistics are changing, and what was perhaps correct in the first months of the war, where there was very intensive bombing, is no longer correct half a year later. I mean, the war that is going now is very different from the war that was going on in October. Yeah. And some criticism, some of which might have been justified back in October, is no longer relevant in where we're now, because the war now, the facts on the ground, the dynamics are completely different. And most of the journalists, they don't seem to care about this. They don't seem to be curious to see, okay, this is like, it's the same logic that when we talked about it in the beginning, they said, okay, they were right in the past, they must be right now. So it's the same kind of intellectual laziness. Something that was right in October must be right now, which is obviously not true. I think one of the things that gets really is not getting enough attention, and I was talking about this in my own Twitter posts, etc. But I hardly see anyone in the media talking about this. That even if we look at the GMO claims, that, as we said, are not so much, not really reliable, to put it mildly. Even if we look at those numbers, the daily number of deaths is sharply going down. I mean, the number of deaths, even the numbers that GMO reported in March or February, are 2 or 3 times lower than what was reported in October or November. and nobody is talking about this. I mean, even GMO admit that the intensity of war is going down. And if you look at the detailed reports of the Ministry of Health, you see that the demographic breakdown changes by their own numbers.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to believe IDF, you don't have to believe me. You just look at the reports that Ministry of Health itself is issuing. You see that there are much more males. The absolute numbers are much smaller. And the people are still stuck in the perception that they kind of formed in the beginning of the war of what is going on.
And I think the dangerous part of that is, you've said a couple of times that if we can assume the IDF is a professional army that has some morality and ethics and what have you, albeit potentially flawed like any other. But I think that's a very big if for much of the world media, because they don't believe that. And I think it's circular, because that's why they don't interrogate the statistics according to the terms you're using, but it's also the justification for them not believing that are the statistics. And so there's a cycle of deception, perhaps wanton deception. And the other thing I would say that might be worth us touching on as we're drawing to the end of the conversation is the idea of other deaths which are not distinguished at all. So we've established that the GMO and the health ministry in Gaza don't list any militant or terrorist or combatant deaths, however we want to describe them. None, not one, as far as I'm aware. So of that number, they don't allow any evaluation of ratio of civilian to combatant to be done from their figures. But also they don't have, it would seem, any totals or even estimates for the number of people they've killed themselves. Again, something the IDF does. The IDF has a running total of soldiers killed in battle, including in friendly fire. And the Gazans don't seem to do that at all. So they're missing out people who, 15% is a number I've seen of misfired rockets, Gazan rockets. So 15% of their rockets fall short within their own territory. One famous example being the hospital we discussed. There must be a number of casualties.
If you match it with the fact that they've been firing thousands upon thousands of rockets, 15% means hundreds, if not thousands, of misfired rockets. So, we can only guess how many casualties those failed rockets caused. I mean, the Al Ahli hospital example, we are talking about tens of casualties in a single incident. So now multiply it by hundreds of similar incidents that happened.
And on top of that, again, these are not necessarily statistical questions, but the precise examples like the Al Ahli are important. And the one that we have more recently of the sons and grandsons of Ismail Haniyeh, who were killed in an Israeli strike. So we know that the sons are, by most people's evaluation, valid military targets, but maybe their children, people would have questions over whether it's proportionate to strike them in their car if their children are with them. But of course, then you need to ask, if you are a high target, military target in Gaza, is it responsible to take your children in a car with you? And did the IDF necessarily know the children were in the car? If they did...
But this is exactly the kind of nuanced discussion that is not taking place for most part in the media. I mean, the questions that you are asking, both from the Hamas perspective, their responsibility and the IDF responsibility, those are legitimate, important questions. Both from the moral and from the legal perspective. It's valid question. It's important that they're being asked.
And I think it's important, by the way, because all these deaths are tragic. Innocent deaths are tragic. And the numbers are high, however we look at this, in just human terms. So all the talk of ratios and statistics are important. But if people are genuinely concerned about those deaths, they then do have a responsibility within their own conscience to question who caused them and who is responsible for them ethically. So I think that's why your analysis, it's not just gameplay. And name calling and blaming the other side. It's a question of truly trying to interrogate who's responsible for what is undeniably a tragic situation.
Exactly. And I think what we talked about earlier, when I was talking about the changing dynamics of war, for me, it's a demonstration of IDF doing reasonably well, or maybe even more than reasonably well, its part. I mean, like issuing warnings, like trying to move the civilian population out of active war zones. So, and you see the results. You see that the demographics are changing. You see that there are far less children and women getting hurt, getting in a crossfire between the militants and the IDF. And unfortunately, from what we've seen, Hamas is doing exactly the opposite. I mean, they were actively preventing the civilians from moving. They now, they have this hostage negotiation talks, and they want to return the civilian population to the north, which, because we know they're using the human shield strategy, would make it much easier for them to fight IDF once the civilians are back there. And we know that if it does happen and the war renews, that it will mean that the civilians' deaths might go up again. Yeah. So this is an absurd situation that you have I wouldn't call them an army there, but you have the militants that are doing everything they can to maximize the casualties of their civilians.
Yeah. And incidentally, I think it's fairly well established now that they aren't just a disorganized, chaotic group of terrorists, as they might once have been characterized. They are basically acting as an army. Yeah, but what they don't have, that most state armies have, especially the IDF, is any sense of ethics or rules of law of war that most countries stick to. So, as you say, they'll readily use children, other civilians as human shields in order to increase those statistics, because that international pressure on Israel for civilian deaths works strategically in their advantage. I'll just, before we do tie up, there's one more area of your research that I wanted to talk about, which was the UNRWA statistics, which I know you wrote about in the Daily Telegraph, because the Daily Telegraph, if I understand it correctly, obtained some UNRWA statistics themselves. There's been a lot of discussion in the media of Israel's recent accidental killing of aid workers from WCK. And that has, of course, changed a lot of the international view on the war in general. That's telling in itself. But UNRWA is the other aid agency. Now, it's worth just mentioning that this war has opened many people's eyes to UNRWA, that UN body that's meant to look after Palestinian refugees, specifically the fact that there is a massive overlap between people that work for UNRWA within Gaza, which is a vast number of people in Gaza work for UNRWA, and people who might also be terrorists or Hamas operatives. So what did you find in those statistics?
Because, I mean, since you brought up the World Kitchen accident, I think it's something important to clarify about UNRWA. The definition is, I mean, they often call it an aid agency, but they are not clear-cut aid agency. I mean, their function is much wider than this. Just to demonstrate, about 70% of all UNRWA staff are teachers. I mean, they're basically replacing the local government in many areas, specifically education and healthcare. Okay, they provide. I mean, there are many UNRWA schools. So, if you take a narrow definition of aid workers, most UNRWA workers are not that. They're doing an important job. They are doing something that the local government is not capable of doing or choosing not to do. But they're not aid workers in the strict sense of the word. Okay? And another thing that is important to say about UNRWA, you mentioned that there are a lot of people working there. And in Gaza alone, there are about 13,000 people who work for UNRWA. Again, there is no precedent in the world, no place. I mean, you take the biggest humanitarian catastrophe that's going on in the world like right now. I mean, you take Sudan, you take what was going on in Syria. You go to look at the other places. You have maybe hundreds of workers of relief agencies working there. Here, you have in a small place of 2 million people, you have 13,000 people who are defined as aid workers, which, as I said, they're not exactly that. So Why is it important? Because it explains to the large extent the seemingly large numbers of UNRWA workers who were killed in this war. I mean, if you have an organization with so many people working, by the pure chance, you'll have tens and hundreds of people who will be killed, not because somebody targeted them, but just because this is very large group, and just as you have civilians who are getting harmed, have nothing to do with fighting or anything, but the collateral damage. Some of the UNRWA deaths are collateral damage as well, and because the UNRWA is such a big organization, you have considerable numbers of stuff that you see in the news. So this is one thing that is important to say. Now, if we dive into the numbers, I mean, Telegraph was provided with a detailed list of people who were killed in the first 3 or 4 months of the war. And there were 150 people on that list. 2/3 of the list are men, although men are minority among the workers in UNRWA. I mean, men amount to something like 40% of the workforce, but there were 2/3 of the casualties. Okay, so this alone is suspicious, and especially if you remember that starting from January, there was information coming out about involvement of many UNRWA workers entanglement with Hamas, with Palestinian jihad. So this is one of the things that could explain why do you see so many male. I mean, if many staff members of UNRWA are involved in some sort of militant activity, it's not surprising to see my disproportionate number of men being killed. UNRWA is interesting also because in the beginning of the war, there were some attempts to verify how accurate the numbers that Ministry of Health was issuing. And there were at least 2 articles in Lancet that said, okay, because UNRWA is such a big organization, and it's roughly sort of a sample of a bigger population, let's look at the UNRWA numbers to see what it tells us about the casualties in general. And they found that in the beginning of the war, there is a close match between the two. The relative number of UNRWA workers that were killed was in the same orders of magnitude as the number of people killed in general. But now, if you look at this, the breakdown, the detailed information, you see that 2/3 of the population of UNRWA workers who were killed were men. Okay, this is clearly not a representative sample of the population. Something is off. But it turned out if I look at the women alone, just the statistics of the female workers, there is incredible, and I was really surprised to see it. I mean, I expected some correlation. I didn't expect the match to be so close. There is near perfect match between the relative number of female workers that were killed and what the hospital records were telling us about the total numbers in general population. I mean, if you look at the graph, they really follow one another. And this is especially important if we go back to what we're talking about, the difference between the hospital reports, the Ministry of Health numbers, and the GMO claims. If you have some group that is sort of representative of the general population, and you see that the way the death statistics are behaving is very similar to what you see in the hospital numbers, for me, it's a clear indication that obviously the hospital's numbers are much closer to the truth, to the total numbers, than what GMO was claiming. I mean, obviously there are some unaccounted deaths in the hospitals, and there might have been missing people, but it's not even close to the scope of what GMO was claiming. I mean, we may be talking about hundreds, maybe 2,000 or 3,000, but not 12,000 or 30,000 as they were claiming at some point. All those reliable media sources that were reporting death from unclear sources. Just another confirmation that what the hospitals were reporting are very close to the actual situation, give or take. And this means that the death numbers are probably inflated by something like at least 30-40%. This is one thing.
So effectively, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I'm very grateful to you for doing that. And I hope that anyone who's stuck with us will be rewarded in their curiosity to better understand this really complex situation. And of course, nobody's saying you have the answer either. That's what we said at the beginning. I think that this is a very tough knot to untangle. But just to recap, what we've covered really is a lack of internal consistency in the numbers themselves. So from any one source, the numbers are often or sometimes inconsistent, with numbers of breakdown sections not adding up to the same as the numbers of totals, whether it's numbers of women and children, numbers of men being representative as negative, and such like. We've covered the idea that there are never any adjustments for clarity when more information becomes available to those collecting the data. We've covered the inconsistency between different sources of information, whether it's the health ministry or the GMO or the UNRWA figures. We've covered the imbalance of the male to female deaths, which suggests better targeting on the part of the IDF towards combatants because they are men on the whole, if not exclusively. We've covered the idea that many of the deaths of minors, of children, are actually in the 16, 17-year-old male section, which may include some of those in the combatant count as well. And we have covered the ropey methods of trying to gather this data, which has resulted in inconsistencies which show blatant fabrication, such as sequential ID numbers that don't add up, duplicate ID numbers that show repetition in the numbers to the thousands. And I think that's so far most of the list. Have I missed anything off?
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. I mean, I could go on and on, but I think we had a lot of things covered, a lot of things for people to process.
Well, and I think it's absolutely extraordinary. It's an embarrassment to me as a journalist that people in my field are just not asking these questions. I think it's a massive, massive shame, to put it mildly, that places like the BBC, with the extensive resources they have, and other news agencies around the world, to be fair, have not made these investigations. You're one man who is accessing open source data and analyzing it with a clear head, not with particularly any political bias, though you're based in Israel. I think that you've done an enormous amount to shed light on this, and I hope that people pay more attention to what you're doing. And I would encourage anyone watching to follow you on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at Mark Zlochin, MarkZlochin. And I hope that people can watch this, rewatch this, glean anything from it. Maybe it will get reported elsewhere. Maybe I'm naive to believe that it will. But thank you for talking us through all this in such detail. And please keep on doing what you're doing. Maybe if you have any more big discoveries, we'll talk again and bring people more information.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.